There are many new approaches to therapy that are dominating the large conferences and generating a lot of excitement, and many of these have not been incorporated into graduate training. In this video, we will explore some of these new areas so that you can be oriented toward them as you are seeking out your own therapy. Because the truth is, there are therapists out there who draw on more than just the traditional CBT, psychodynamic, or humanistic approaches. And as someone seeking therapy, you have the right to know about them. So let's dive in. So I would like to start with the newest, most recently developed branch of therapy called the experiential branch. There are many forms of experiential therapy, and that number is quickly growing. And some, like IFS, internal family systems, or somatic approaches, like somatic experiencing, are really getting very popular. Why? Well, I think because it is this branch that most closely aligns with the brain science. And that science is simply capturing people's interests, People have gotten really into ideas like neuroplasticity, the mind-body connection, how trauma impacts our nervous system, how the brain seems to change most through new experiences versus just our conscious thoughts, etc. From this science, there are just all of these new realizations around what a deeper level of healing might look like. That is why so many people are really geeking out, learning all about the brain and experiential techniques and trying to reimagine what might even be possible in the realm of psychotherapy. I think that has led to this almost like renaissance happening in our field. I like to call this the experiential therapy movement, and it is the main focus of my channel. I chose it as a focus because it is something we don't learn about in graduate school, perhaps because it is what is happening right now, and it's almost hard to keep up with it in real time. And while there are so many interesting facets when it comes to experiential work, let me get straight to the bottom line, which would be to explain this particular branch's theory of change. If you didn't watch the previous video, every branch of therapy has its own theory of change that outlines what change is all about. And it is perhaps the most important thing to consider when choosing a therapy. Okay, so when it comes to the various experiential therapies, the core shared idea is that the deepest form of change happens when we update the imprints about reality that are held in our implicit memory system, or you might say in our subcortical or even our emotional brain. Many of these imprints are taken in during trauma, which is why there is so much emphasis in using experiential techniques in treating trauma. So here's the cliff notes. When we experience pain or danger, our brain is absorbing learnings and associations like a sponge. It is most powerfully learning what to fear and how to survive. This is how conditioning happens. And that is all very adaptive, except when we pick up learnings or imprints that really harm us emotionally. Like maybe we learn that we can't trust anyone, or maybe we can't even trust ourselves or our emotions, or that if we set a boundary, we will be rejected. We might even be conditioned to fear our own fear response, which is common in trauma. These notions about what is safe or dangerous and just what we can expect from reality can be true to our emotional brain even when our rational brain knows better. Now, some of these knowings might make their way up into conscious thought, like if we have an emotional learning that we are pathetic and don't deserve love, that is likely to color the nature of our thoughts or self-talk. But according to this view, that pattern of thought isn't created by our conscious mind and certainly can't be changed by it. When it comes to really any of our patterns, whether those be around our self-talk or our behavioral patterns or emotional reactions, those patterns are based on what we picked up about reality on an emotional level. And those learnings are held in implicit memory, which by its nature is non-conscious and can't be changed through thinking differently. So there's a bit of divergence here with traditional CBT thought. Thankfully, the neuroscience has shown us that it is possible to update the neural networks that hold our implicit maps of reality, sometimes called our schemas, through an innate process called memory reconsolidation. If you happen to be interested in the science of memory reconsolidation, please check my video with that title. For now, I'll just share an important bottom line from that research in terms of its implications for therapy. And that is that if we want to set up the conditions for memory reconsolidation to occur, we must first in some way touch into or become conscious of our deeper emotional knowings in a felt way. Like, for instance, allowing ourselves to really hear from the part of us that says that we have to be perfect, or somatically feel into the gut sense of danger or shame. That kind of listening internally to what is underneath is called bottom-up processing, and you can think of it as a mindfulness practice aimed at inner exploration, where we are letting the deeper mind speak and be heard rather than simply intellectualizing about ourselves. Of course, there are many ways to do that. You can do it through noticing what is happening in the body, or through catching words that come to mind organically, what we sometimes call limbic language. You might notice images, or metaphors, or emotions, or just gut-level knowings. Learning to explore what is underneath is powerful in and of itself, but it isn't enough. There still needs to be some kind of corrective experience or realization, some kind of new information that comes in that can work to update the old imprint once it is accessed. According to the science of memory reconsolidation, if you are able to activate the old knowing or prediction, while simultaneously witnessing information that disproves or disconfirms it, then the old learning or memory becomes deconsolidated or open for new learning. When that happens, we have the chance to update or even dissolve whatever old emotional truth or fear has been driving us. Again, that becomes possible the moment we bring those imprints into conscious awareness while simultaneously finding ways to stay grounded and curious and aware of all the other deeper truths that our wisest, most adult self might be able to remember or notice. Again, this both and creates what neuroscientists call the mismatch experience that is needed to unlock memory reconsolidation so that the new knowing or felt truth can finally replace the old. Now, that can be done through parts work, because when we hear from a younger part what it learned, while also bringing online what the adult self knows, we've created a mismatch. It can be done through somatic techniques, because when we use the body to both activate old learnings or frozen states and then create a more empowered experience through the body, again, it triggers a mismatch. You can get there through emotional processing, because if the therapist accompanies the client through their emotions, this is a chance to undo deep imprints that predict aloneness and overwhelm. Again, through having an experience that is the opposite of the prediction, a mismatch is created. There are many ways to galvanize this mismatch and therefore memory consolidation, but they all require experiential techniques. And there are many experiential techniques that can work, which is why there are so many different forms of experiential therapy. All right, so if this theory of change appeals to you, what options might you have? Well, you could do a therapy based on parts work. While there are many of these, the most popular is IFS, and I have a whole series on IFS to watch if you want to learn more. If you really like that first psychodynamic view of change I described in the last video, but also want to work experientially and learn to be comfortable with your feelings, you might look into ISTDP or AADP. Again, you could check out my whole series on AADP. If you have more serious attachment trauma, you could look into the 3 pillars approach for treating attachment trauma. If you like somatic work, you could try somatic experiencing or sensory motor psychotherapy, or Hakomi. These are all brilliant models. I have a whole series on coherence therapy, which is great for people who like to directly map out their unconscious mind using language. As time passes, psychedelic-assisted therapy will even become more available. I think that's super exciting. There are even some new approaches like rapid resolution therapy or reconsolidation of traumatic memories protocol that are specifically aimed at resolving PTSD. Those would be a good fit for someone struggling after a single event trauma. Although I would say all experiential therapies are great with trauma, that's sort of what makes this umbrella stand out. If you want to learn more about experiential therapy in general, I have a whole series just on experiential therapy that covers the science behind it, as well as its history and techniques. I'll link to that below as well. All right, so what other kinds of conversations around change are more recently getting attention? Well, I'd say the transpersonal or spiritual perspective is being focused on more and more. Now, to be clear, the spiritual perspective of change is like the original lens through which we humans approached change or healing. And even in psychology, it is not at all new to incorporate a spiritual lens. And I'm not talking so much about religion-specific counseling, like Christian counseling, for instance, but by the way, that is available too if you want to seek it out. But here I'm talking about spirituality as a larger frame for understanding psychology, or what we might call transpersonal psychology. Now again, even transpersonal psychology is not new. It started in the 60s with the human potential movement. However, I have noticed it recently getting more and more interest and attention. I mean, you'll pretty regularly see on therapist profiles these days some mention of integrating spirituality into their work. That was not always the case. And there's probably 2 reasons for that change. One, because of the emergence of experiential approaches to therapy and all the interest in the brain, which we just talked about, as well as the multicultural movement, which we will be reviewing after this. Let's touch on the multicultural movement's influence first. As we will talk about next, the multicultural movement is huge in our field. It's the only topic, other than ethics, that we are required to get training in every year. And if you take multicultural sensitivity seriously, it makes no sense to ask people to leave their religion or spirituality at the door. After all, most people consider themselves spiritual, and in fact, it's often a huge part of their cultural heritage. Because of this, the multicultural movement has had some ripple effects, in as much as it's opened the doorway to other ways of knowing and approaching change that aren't strictly scientific. That being said, while these ways of knowing might not source from science, the impact they have on us has indeed been scientifically validated. And that brings us to how the experiential movement we just talked about, and this emerging interest in the brain, has also helped make way for spirituality to come back onto the scene. Spirituality dovetails with the experiential theory of change, because spiritual practices are certainly an example of something experiential working to change our brain, which many people are fascinated by. People are studying the nature of religious experiences, or what are called enlightenment experiences. They are studying the brain activity of Buddhist masters and longtime meditators. I think the psychedelic-assisted therapy movement is also part of this emergence because it often elicits very deep spiritual experiences or even awakenings in people. It is really clear that spiritual practices, whether prayer, meditation, yoga, have powerful impacts on our brain in some important and deep ways. So that science, along with the multicultural movement, has created a space for spiritual practice across many traditions to be a topic of conversation at large conferences. More and more, spiritual teachers are even being brought in to deepen the conversation, which I personally think is wonderful. I mean, just to bring this point to life, I was one of 2 moderators at a large conference a few years ago where we interviewed a lot of neat people. And while many of them were therapists, we interviewed Terry Real and Pat Ogden and Dick Schwartz, I personally had the chance to interview this amazing Rabbi Firestone, as well as this wonderful African mystic and a Buddhist teacher, etc. That's not uncommon these days to see therapists and spiritual leaders in conversation or on shared panels. Okay, I know that's a lot of context, and I haven't yet described the transpersonal or spiritual theory of change. Obviously, there's no way I can do it justice, and I certainly can't touch on every version that comes out of all the various religious traditions. However, if you allow me to try to describe the overarching ethos of a more spiritual view of change in a general way, I would say the belief is that change or inner liberation occurs the moment we shift to serving something larger than ourselves. In this view of change, the ego or individual self is in some ways diminished or demoted. And I don't mean shamed, I just mean taken out of the center where it is the most important thing in the world. That way there can be a shift away from serving ourself towards serving the sacred, whether that be God, or a deeper mission of decreasing the suffering of the world, or of connecting to the universe, or whatever feels sacred to us. In that moment, we learn to no longer hold as our main goal this frantic movement away from suffering and toward happiness. After all, the aim of the spiritual endeavor is not the advancement of our own personal station. Now that might sound kind of harsh, but ironically, the moment we stop being so afraid of suffering and so attached to constant happiness, the more happy and at peace we are likely to be. As we all know, modern society pushes very superficial values like beauty and money and fame and pleasure. And we now have the research that proves those things do not buy happiness nor fulfillment. What does? Well, the main ones, according to the research, are giving, chances to give, and loving relationships. So we're talking here about acts of service and love, connection, basically. Those are the core ingredients, and if we add some kind of spiritual practice that retrains our brain to be more in the moment, that also doesn't hurt. And I think this is why a lot of people are looking towards spirituality as a source of sustenance and healing, because it holds a lot of what we need to have a beautiful and meaningful life. In my mind, there's also just this deep undoing of aloneness that can come from spiritual seeking. And that usually has either one of 2 flavors. Either a very personal one, where there's a deep connection to a loving God, or a more universal one, where there's a sense of oneness of being or a feeling of the unity between all things. And because loneliness is such an epidemic, I think there's really a place for spiritual goals, spiritual practices, spiritual experiences, not to mention spiritual community, to be a powerful medicine. So if you are looking to start therapy, you are absolutely allowed to look for a therapist who can incorporate a spiritual or even religious element. In fact, our current APA president said, quote, "If a large part of the way that people see themselves, make meaning, and understand and approach their challenges is connected to their faith, traditions, and beliefs, it is against our ethical guidelines to ignore that. So it is actually considered an ethical imperative that therapists be open to your spiritual beliefs and experiences," which is a huge shift in our field. In the early days, we just ignored that area because we were psychologists trying to be so scientific. But now the official stance is that spirituality matters and can be a huge resource. That stance is both supported by the science and the multicultural movement. That being said, if you want a therapist that actually knows how to incorporate a spiritual focus in the work, I would suggest finding someone who mentions it in their bio or even has some kind of credentials. Because again, just like with the experiential forms of therapy, the spiritual side of healing is also not something we get training in during graduate school. Even after the multicultural movement was in full force, 80% of practicing psychologists said they received little or no training on addressing spiritual and religious issues during therapy. But that brings us to the final movement I want to mention, which is the only one from this video that is actually a huge point of focus during graduate training, and that is the multicultural movement itself. So yes, the multicultural movement is the third new big movement in our field I would like to mention, and you might be surprised to hear me call it new, given that it has gotten so much attention and already has tons of research behind it. And as I said, it is actually something we do learn a lot about during graduate school. But it really only took off about 20 years ago, which is pretty new for our field. Remember, the three main umbrella therapies I mentioned in the last video all started in the 50s or before. That being said, the multicultural movement is not a branch of therapy, unlike other branches I have been mentioning. Still, it has become a big part of the conversation around change and how it should be approached. Now, theoretically, multicultural sensitivity is something all therapists are supposed to embrace. Again, it isn't a type of therapy. It's a required skill or training that should be brought into any type of therapy, like that of ethics. That being said, not all therapists do actually embrace this aspect of the work or have been eager to learn about and be sensitive to issues around culture, not to mention race, which we will talk about in a moment. So the reason I wanted to mention multicultural awareness in this video, aimed at helping people decide what kind of therapy to engage in, is that if this is something you sense will matter to you, which will be more likely if you are not a member of the dominant culture, then add it to the list of things you are looking for in a therapist. That being said, because of the push toward multicultural awareness, most therapists will put something about it on their bio, whether it's really a point of focus for them or not. Still, for therapists who have a real passion in this area and have received a lot of extra training beyond the requirements, you will likely be able to tell from their bios because it will show up as more than just a one-line reference. You can also look for a therapist who shares your cultural background if you can find one. Now, that's not always possible, but if you happen to call a large treatment center, it doesn't hurt to ask. Again, if you sense that this will matter to you. So why might it matter? Well, trying to summarize that in a few paragraphs is very difficult. However, I'll point to a few bottom lines. I think one of them is that most of psychology, from psychology research to theory development, has been focused on understanding and helping white Westerners. In fact, even to this day, most research is done on college students, which for many decades didn't even include women. And because we weren't aware of our own biases, we just considered our theories to be scientific and universal, rather than being based on a Western cultural perspective. But of course, that's ridiculous. There are many, many paths up the mountain of creating a good and healthy life, and of course, culture is going to play a huge role in determining which path is a fit. So a foundational message from the multicultural movement has been to stop pushing theories of change that aren't a cultural fit, but rather to try to find approaches, or just ways of interacting, that are in alignment with the client's values and background. Now, there's a whole other element to this as well, which has taken center stage since the anti-racism movement took off, which is a separate movement, but overlaps enough here that I think it's worth mentioning. And that is around the importance of developing not only a multicultural sensitivity, but a sensitivity to the unique traumas and stressors faced by traditionally marginalized groups. So there's a movement in our field to focus on issues around oppression, and while it goes beyond any particular type of therapy, I do want to mention that there is something called feminist therapy that aims in this direction. It began during the feminist movement to address issues around gender and sexism, but now stretches to include racism, homophobia, classism, etc. So if you see a therapist include a feminist approach in their list of theories they draw from, they are likely to have interest in working with traditionally marginalized groups. But again, anti-racism obviously goes beyond even the field of psychology, let alone one approach to therapy. So let me now touch on some of the ways the movement has challenged the status quo in terms of our theories of change. I'll just give one example to bring it to life. For decades, our field has been focused on helping people heal the wounds dealt to them by their parents, almost as if all of our suffering comes from childhood wounds, especially those experienced within the home. But of course, people suffer from wounds outside of the family, not just from racism, but from poverty, inequity, homophobia, war. There are many stressors that come from outside the family, think of COVID even, and then those stressors fall on different groups in unfair and unequal ways. So again, if you sense that much of your suffering comes from traumas or struggles that play out on a more societal level or that have landed specifically on your group, this is something to think about when looking for a therapist. It might even be worth looking for someone who specializes in this area. It is so new that most therapists still haven't had training in it. Yes, we do focus a lot on multicultural awareness in grad school, but I'm really now more touching on the trauma side of things, and student therapists don't usually learn how to work very deeply with trauma, period. At least not at a somatic or felt level. That being said, outside of graduate school, somatic approaches to healing racialized traumas or other traumas dealt by society are becoming more and more popular. And if a therapist has training in this area, they're likely to mention it in their bios. That being said, therapy isn't the only option when it comes to this kind of work that focuses on reclaiming power and pride. In fact, one important element within this theory of change is a push to move beyond simply focusing on healing individual wounds individually, like an individual therapy, toward healing collective wounds collectively. If that strikes a chord, you might look into Resmaa Menakem's work in somatic abolitionism, or Dr. Shelley Harrell's work with soulfulness as a form of liberation. I'm legitimately obsessed with her work and her as a person, Dr. Shelley Harrell. But there are many others focusing on embodied healing, often specifically for people of color. There's a lot of community to be found and different workshops and retreats and trainings designed to bring people together in healing ways. Okay, so we've briefly covered 3 different areas of study that are becoming more popular and sparking a lot of excitement. I put them together in one video because at conferences, they overlap in some really interesting ways. There's a lot of experiential or somatic work integrated with anti-racism. There's a lot of exploration of spirituality and other aspects of culture playing a big role in trauma healing. There's the integration between brain science and spiritual awakening. There are conversations around how all 3 can come together to shore up our resilience as we face collective stressors like global warming. In fact, there's more conversation around collective healing work in general. And if you are just coming out of graduate school and go to a large conference, there's a good chance that you will feel completely disoriented, because all of it will be so new and different from the kinds of things we learn in school. So I hope this video can orient you new therapists just a bit. But to that end, let me say what prompted me to make the previous video in which I outlined the more traditional therapy camps, and this one where we touched on some of the newer movements in our field. And that is because I believe any consumer of therapy should be educated as to their options. There's research showing that when a client is able to select what kind of approach they want to engage in, they are more likely to benefit from therapy. The truth is, not every type of therapy or therapist will be a good fit. So if you want to begin therapy, I suggest reflecting on which of these core theories of change most powerfully resonates with you. Whether you want to draw on some of the more traditional models of change or jump into some of these new frontiers, you have the right to go in the direction that feels true to what you believe and value and find hopeful. I'm Dr. Tori Olds, and as always, I so appreciate your watching. Thanks so much for watching. I just want to mention our Patreon community is really taking off, and I've been so enjoying getting a chance to know so many of you guys. If you would like to join our community and join our conversations, please check out my Patreon page.